rather than me being the teacher, Lord, I pray that you would teach us from your word and that we would be built up by it, that our knowledge would not just be head knowledge, but a knowledge of you, and that would increase our faith. In Jesus' name, amen. So Genesis is basically broken into 4 parts. And you know the thing about Genesis is not its own book. You realize like Exodus is a part of Genesis, and so is Leviticus, and it's all the same, right? Book flow through our English translations, well, the Hebrew too, but it's broken it into parts. But really, it's a long story that keeps going, and it's one story in the scriptures. But Genesis itself is basically broken into 4 parts. There's the primeval narrative of Genesis 1 through 11. So that's creation of the world all the way to the Tower of Babel. The next part is Abraham's story. We spent quite a bit of time on Abraham's story. The next part is Jacob's story. So Jacob is actually Abraham's grandson. It doesn't say much about Isaac because he's a big part of Abraham's story. But then after Jacob has 12 sons, and the son that the book of Genesis chooses to focus on is Joseph, one of his later sons. Now, why do you think the author of Genesis, who I take as Moses, focused on Joseph so much? Why does he from chapter 37 to the end of the book, chapter 50, he focuses on Joseph's story? Why is that? Why Joseph? What's that? He knows a lot about Egypt? Yeah. Mike over here. There's a mic right there.
Oh, I'm sorry. Just one thing comes to mind, his dreams, that prediction of what would, prophetic.
Yeah, he has dreams that are prophetic about the future and what's going to happen with him in the future, the dreams that come from God. This is 1 Chronicles 5, verses 1 and 2. The sons of Reuben. Reuben was the firstborn of Jacob. So you would think the story would be about Reuben, right? The sons of Reuben, the firstborn of Israel. He was the firstborn, but he defiled his father's marriage bed. But when he defiled his father's marriage bed, his rights as firstborn were given to the sons of Joseph, son of Israel. So he could not be listed in the genealogical record in accordance with his birthright. And though Judah was the strongest of his brothers, and a ruler came from him, the rights of the firstborn belonged to Joseph. Now, that's interesting. Remember what we talked about with Jacob and the birthright that came along to him? The birthright not only meant leadership of the family, and for Jacob that was a huge deal because the family, the household was hundreds of people, right? It's like he was a little king and lots of wealth. It was not only leadership of the family and a double portion of the inheritance that the firstborn got, or with the birthright, but also the blessing passed down from Abraham, the original blessing. And now he's saying that Joseph received the birthright. So it said Reuben defiled his father's marriage bed. What he means by that is there's a little story in Genesis where Reuben sleeps with his father's concubine. Right? Jacob had 4 wives, 2 main wives, and then the wives' servants also he married. And so Reuben was born from Leah, right? Jacob's first wife. But he took Rachel's servant and slept with her. And so that he defiled his marriage bed and he lost his rights. The next 2 in line were Levi and Simeon. Simeon and Levi. But those 2 did something awful. You remember what they did? In chapter 35, their sister Dinah was taken by some people around the area of Shechem, and she was raped. And then the man asked to marry Dinah. But Levi and Simeon were so angry that they played a ruse on them. They said, in order to marry our daughter, you all need to become circumcised. And while they were down and out because they had just circumcised themselves, they went and killed the whole town. Right? I don't know if that's why they lost their rights. But Judah, who was the next in line, he was the fourth born son of Jacob. In chapter 38, we'll learn that he did something terrible as well. And so the birthright ends up coming to Joseph, the first son of Jacob's favorite wife, Rachel. But what's interesting is that Joseph, as far as it goes, is not as important as Judah in the overall story of the Bible. From Judah comes the king. From Joseph comes the tribes of Ephraim and Manasseh, the biggest tribes in the northern kingdom. They were important. And Levi was important too because the priesthood came from him. But the author of Genesis wants us to see that what happens to Joseph here in his life is what's going to carry on the nation of Israel throughout their history. And so let's look. This is chapter 37. I'm going to read a little bit of it, and then we'll talk some more. Jacob lived in the land where his father had stayed, the land of Canaan. This is the account of Jacob's family line. Joseph, a man of 17, was tending the flocks with his brothers, the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah. Those were the two concubine wives, his father's wives. And he brought his father a bad report about them. Now Israel, that's Jacob's other name, loved Joseph more than any of his other sons, because he had been born to him in old age, and he made an ornate robe for him. When his brothers saw that their father loved him more than any of them, they hated him and could not speak a kind word to him. Now, why did Jacob love Joseph more than his other brothers? Because he loved Rachel more than Leah. He loved the mother of Joseph more than he loved the mother of the other kids. You see how favoritism causes such terrible things to happen within a family. It's happened with Isaac and with his sons, Jacob and Esau. It happened before that with Abraham, with Sarah, though it was a good thing that he chose Isaac. But favoritism runs its course. And so even though his brothers were older and more experienced than he was, Jacob put Joseph in a supervisory role of his shepherd business. And that's what a cloak means. So he has a cloak of many colors. It wasn't just that it was a fancy robe. What was so special about it is that showed that he was in charge. Can you imagine putting your little 17-year-old brother, when you're 40, 45 years old, he's in charge of you now when you've been shepherding your whole life. And because your dad likes him better, not because of any qualification. That must have been frustrating. And so this is the situation that's boiling over. Look at verse 5. Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him all the more. He said to them, "Listen to the dream I had. We were binding sheaves of grain out in the field, when suddenly my sheaf rose and stood upright, while your sheaves gathered around mine and bowed to it." His brothers said, "Do you intend to reign over us? Will you actually rule us?" And they hated him all the more because of his dream, what he said. Then he had another dream, and he told it to his brothers. "Listen," he said, "I had another dream, and this time the sun and moon and 11 stars were bowing down to me." When he told his father, as well as his brothers, his father rebuked him and said, "What is this dream that you had? Your mother and I and your brothers actually come and bow down to the ground before you?" His brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the matter in mind. You know, dreams were taken very seriously in the ancient world. And dreams were taken seriously because they often were thought to contain messages from God. But they always had to be interpreted. When Joseph shared his dream with his brothers, the interpretation was fairly obvious, right? They knew right away, you know, there's these 12 sheaves, and only one of them stands up and every one of them bows down. It makes sense. And then he had another dream with basically the same meaning. That's important because 2 dreams confirm that it was from God and that it'll certainly come true. That was the idea. Now, does that dream come true? What happens at the end of Joseph's story? Do you remember? They all bow down to him when they come to him in Egypt. But his brothers were jealous. They were angry with him. And one day, as you know, I won't read this part of the story, but one day his father sends him out to check on his brothers, to supervise them, to report on them that they're doing their work well. And when he finds them, they throw him into a cistern, and they plan to kill him. Do you remember who it was that said, don't kill him, right? Just send him off, let him be sold into slavery. Who was it? No, it was Reuben. That's right. Reuben, the older brother. Judah does something good later as well. But Judah came up with the idea of selling him to the Midianites. They sold him to Potiphar, who was a servant of Pharaoh, but he was an extremely important high official. Now, the theme of jealousy and hatred between brothers is something that goes throughout Genesis. Have you noticed that? Started with Cain and Abel, and then with Noah's sons, and then sort of with Ishmael and Isaac, and then with Jacob and Esau, and now Joseph with his 11 brothers. There's a fighting, there's a struggling that goes on. The enmity and hatred between brothers is a part of the sin of the fall. But we can see in this story that God works to reverse that. You know, I think in our lives, one of the saddest things is when family members are at odds with each other. What does that show, right? That needs to be brought back to harmony. That's the way it's supposed to be. But later in their history, the tribes of Israel are at war. Did you notice that? Judah, if you know how this works, Judah becomes the southern kingdom. Just Judah, the tribe. And the other, 10 tribes go to the north, and they fight. Israel basically breaks apart. And one of the great prophecies in the Old Testament is that God is going to send the Messiah. And what will the Messiah do? He will unify God's people under one nation, one family of God again. And that's part of the reason why the church, it's so important that we stay unified and that we don't fight against each other. One thing I've noticed, this is a little bit of a rabbit trail, but is that sometimes people are so willing to get upset and leave a church over one doctrine, and they forget the important doctrine of the unity of the church and of being together and being faithful to each other. All right. Now look at chapter 38. This is an interesting chapter because we started with Joseph, and now we take a break, and we go look at Judah. Just one chapter to go and look at Judah, but we don't look at any of the other brothers. Why do you think he does that? Why take a break to go look at Judah? Bob says the lineage. That's right. From Judah comes the anointed one, David. And of course, from him comes the anointed one, the Messiah, Jesus. But we need to know Judah's story. And Judah has an interesting story because Judah married a Canaanite woman. Right? Now, it was wrong to marry a Canaanite woman. We heard last week how Jacob had to travel all the way to Haran to find himself a wife so that it could stay in the family. The Canaanites were cursed. They were doomed. If Judah continued to go along with the Canaanites, if his family line came through them, then his people would be under the curse, right? And so he marries this woman and has children by her. And his sons marry a woman who's related to their family, Tamar, or at least is not a Canaanite. And of course, there's a big story there, but they die, all those guys, without giving her a child. And then after all of Judah's sons die, he must think that this woman is cursed or something. He sends her away back to her family house. And she tricks him in order that Judah, and she pretends to be a prostitute, Judah has a child by her. And from Judah and Tamar's line come the people in the people from Judah's tribe. And so it's a pretty amazing story, but we see that God, even through sin, even through sleeping with a prostitute, he doesn't let his plan fall to the ground. No matter what he does, he's organizing it and orchestrating it to bring Jesus through. All right, now back to Joseph's story. Let's read a little bit of chapter 39. Now Joseph had been taken down to Egypt. Potiphar, an Egyptian who was one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard, brought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him there. The Lord was with Joseph so that he prospered, and he lived in the house of his Egyptian master. When his master saw that he found favor in his eyes and became his attendant, Potiphar put him in charge of his household, and he entrusted to his care everything he owned. From the time he put him in charge of his household and of all that he owned, the Lord blessed the household of the Egyptian because of Joseph. The blessing of the Lord was on everything Potiphar did, both in house and field. And so Potiphar left everything he had in Joseph's care. With Joseph in charge, he did not concern himself with anything except the food he ate. There's a line that's repeated in this chapter 3 times. The Lord was with Joseph. That made all the difference. The Lord was with Joseph. Despite his terrible circumstances, God's presence helped Joseph be successful. And people noticed that the Lord was with Joseph too. They couldn't put a finger on what that meant exactly, but his work, his character, his personality, they all seemed more attractive. Now, as time went on, you heard, Potiphar trusted Joseph, put more responsibility on his plate until he was over the whole household. But as you know, as we read the story, something went wrong. Potiphar's wife became attracted to Joseph, tried to seduce him. And when, because he had integrity, he refused her and ran away, she took the opportunity to frame him. Very familiar story. Potiphar sent Joseph to prison, right? So Joseph's integrity and God being with him led to a prison cell. Have you thought about that? First it led to slavery, and then it led to being framed and being sent to prison. That's interesting. I believe that God is with everyone who has his Holy Spirit. But like Joseph, it doesn't mean that everything's going to go our way. Even if we hold and maintain our integrity, even if God really is working with us and working through our story, we can't always see the big picture. And that's one of the themes of Joseph's story. If Joseph hadn't been framed, what would have happened? He would have just stayed in Potiphar's house, right? I guess that was nice. But he would have never accomplished what God wanted to accomplish through him, which was the saving of the world, right? Which we'll see. There's a verse that I like from Proverbs about integrity. This is Proverbs 10:9. Whoever walks with integrity walks securely, but he who would take crooked paths will be found out. Joseph walked with integrity, and even though he was in a prison cell, even though things seemed to go wrong, he walked securely, and God kept being with him. And so even in the prison cell, we find that he rises up to become the warden's second in command because God was with him. Now, chapter 40, we won't read this whole chapter, but I'll just describe it. You're probably familiar with it, most of you. But in prison, he comes across the king's cupbearer and the king's baker. They'd been sent to prison because their master was angry with them. We don't know exactly why he was angry with them. But for the second time, God uses dreams to communicate. By the way, have any of you had a dream that you felt like was from God? They're pretty rare, I think, sometimes, at least for most people. But you can always tell at least a dream that has meaning from a dream that's just you're thinking crazy things, right? There's something to it. There's a gravity to it after you have a dream. And Joseph had learned, or maybe he'd been gifted by the Lord, to be able to interpret dreams. And so he comes, he talks to the cupbearer and the baker. He knows that they're frustrated or sad. And so he interprets their dreams. Do you remember what the dreams were? One had a dream that meant in 3 days he would be released and go back to work. That was the cupbearer for the king. The other had a dream that in 3 days he'd be released and would be hanged by the king, right? And Joseph hoped that when these men, when the man that lived knew about Joseph and what he did for him, he would find a way to get Joseph out of prison. But he didn't. For 2 years, he was in prison, right? Sometimes maintaining integrity and God being with you just takes a long time, from what I understand, for things to happen, right? You just got to keep living his way, keep doing the right thing. And so in chapter 41, after 2 years, God finally acts. What happened was Pharaoh had a dream, and he was all frustrated about what it meant. He was sure it meant something. But the cupbearer says, oh, I know somebody who knows something about dreams, right? The dream was interesting. Pharaoh had a dream that there were two dreams, by the way, that meant the same thing. Remember how 2 dreams confirms that it's from God. The 7 cows that were fat and the 7 cows that were lean, right? And of course that meant 7 years of plenty and then 7 years of famine. And so Pharaoh is amazed. The spirit of the gods must be in this person because he can interpret my dream. He puts Joseph in charge, second in command of all Egypt, and Joseph puts away rations and stuff for the 7 years. They didn't just waste their food, they collected it all. And so when the 7 years of famine hit, everyone came to Pharaoh begging for food because that's where all the food had been collected. They collected enough for the whole world. And so Joseph sold the grain at a high price. He made tons of money for Pharaoh, but he kept the whole world from starving. Now, this is especially significant because Joseph didn't just save the world. He saved his own family. By doing what he did, by the Lord being with him, he rescued those people in Canaan, in the promised land, and that included his family. So in chapter 42, we hear the famine is just as severe. And Jacob sends his son down to get food. He sends the 10 brothers. And they go up to Joseph, and Joseph recognizes him, but they don't recognize him. Why do you think that is? What's that, Jim? Years have passed. Well, he recognizes them. He looks Egyptian. Egyptians dress differently. He probably had royal stuff on. Yeah, he was 17 at the time. Now he's, like Jim said that too. Yeah. But Joseph plays around with them. I honestly think he's still a little angry, or maybe a lot angry. He claims you're foreign spies, right? They aren't there to get food. They're there to mess with Pharaoh and his power, right? They promise we aren't. And we're all, they tell him their story. We're all brothers of one father, and we just have one other brother who's at home. That was Benjamin, Joseph's younger brother, his full brother. His only brother that was full. And Joseph uses that, right? He says, oh, well, if your story is really true and you're not foreign spies, go back and get Benjamin and bring him back to me. And he kept Simeon in prison as a collateral, right? And when they went back to Canaan to get their grain, they were scared. Benjamin was so precious to Jacob, right? Because Joseph died. This was his, remember, the favoritism thing is still going on. This is my son. Don't take him away. He's my little boy, you know? And he wouldn't part with them for anything. And he said no. And they went hungry for a long time until finally Jacob said, go back and get grain. And they said, we can't. The Egyptian said he'd kill us if we came back without Benjamin. And so he sends them with Benjamin, of course. And they go when they run out of grain. This is chapter 43 now. And when they got down to Joseph, they told him, I skipped some parts. But anyway, when they send them back, or they come together in chapter 43, and Joseph invites them to eat with him, which is a big deal. First he's calling them foreign spies, and now he says, come eat with me. And they come and eat in this room, and Benjamin gets a portion that's 5 times bigger than everybody else's. And they wonder why that is. And then he sends them on their way home, but he puts a silver cup, you remember this, in Benjamin's bag. And they go there and they see it, and that night on their journey, Joseph sends a servant to catch them. And he says to the brothers, one of you stole my special cup, and you're all going to go in prison. And they said, no, we didn't steal anything. And then they open up, and it's Benjamin's bag. Remember, this was terrible. It could have been anybody else's bag. It had to be Benjamin's bag that the cup was placed in. And they fell on his face, and here's where Judah comes in. He offers himself to be a slave for life in the place of Benjamin so that he wouldn't do this. At this, Joseph can't contain himself. Joseph cries a lot. You notice that whenever you read the story? There's such a change. And what amazes him here is when he was 17, his brothers, without mercy, threw him in a cistern, sent him off. And now Benjamin is in trouble. And they're begging on their knees not to have them take the boy. They're offering themselves in his place. And there's such a change in them that Judah was willing to offer himself for Benjamin that Joseph just left the room and wept uncontrollably. Everybody in the palace heard. And when the brothers found out, and then he goes and he says, I'm Joseph. He reveals himself. And you can imagine the brothers' reaction when he told them. They were terrified. But Joseph says this, and let's read. This is chapter 45, 5 through 7. He says, let's start at verse 4. Then Joseph said to his brothers, come close to me. When the brothers had done so, he said, I'm your brother Joseph, the one you sold into Egypt. And now do not be distressed and don't be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. It was for 2 years now, there's been a famine in the land, and for the next 5 there will be no plowing or reaping. But God sent me ahead of you to prepare for you a remnant on earth and to save your lives by a great deliverance. And so he reassured them, this has been God's plan all along, right? That he brought me here. Yes, you did something bad, but God is doing something good through it. You know, I think it'd be good to look at our own lives in that respect. Has God brought me to a place where I love him and where I have faith in him? Even if all these bad things happen in the past. Maybe God planned it this way, and it's all for the good because of what he's doing in my life, what he's done in me, right? So Joseph told his brothers to go back home, get all their stuff, bring their father, bring all their family to the land of Egypt, and that he would provide for them. And that, by the way, is why at the beginning of the book of Exodus, the whole nation of Israel is in the land of Egypt. But Joseph had come to realize something really important. People may try to hurt you. They might even do terrible things to you, but God is in control of the outcome. That is a lesson to learn. Why be mad when someone treats you wrongfully? A person can do nothing to you. This is what Psalm 56:4 says. I trust in the Lord, will not be afraid. What can mere mortals do to me? Joseph learned that lesson. He had been treated terribly all along. Been framed, been sold, been framed, went to prison, been left there. Just all these things happened. But God was with him and in control. So for the last few chapters, they come down to Egypt. Jacob comes with them. They're given that special land of Goshen. There's an interesting chapter in 48 where Jacob blesses Joseph's two sons and claims them as his own because he lost Joseph, and so he claims his two sons. And this is an interesting thing with the idea of election in Genesis, but Joseph switches his hands and blesses the younger one and gives him the rights of the inheritance. And it's almost like God is doing this, choosing through him. And in chapter 50, you can turn there if you'd like, Jacob finally dies. They bring him back and bury him in the promised land like he requested. And once he dies, once their father dies, the brothers are terrified again. Now Joseph's in charge. What's he going to do? He doesn't have his father to worry about anymore. And they're afraid that Joseph's going to kill them all. But he says to them, don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? And this is a famous line. You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. Notice that God had a plan in mind, and that plan cannot be obstructed. That's part of faith, is realizing God has a plan in mind, and no matter what happens, it's going to happen, right? People can't stop it. God's plans are always for good. They're never for evil. Good will always win out at the end of our story, at the end of the story of the world, because God is good, and he's going to have his way. There's another proverb I like, 21:30. There's no wisdom, no insight, no plan that can succeed against the Lord. But the plan is bigger than just to do good things for Joseph. And that's something we should realize too. God is not just orchestrating the whole world and the things that happened to make our lives feel better. There's a bigger thing going on than us. The plan is not us. The plan is Jesus. It's been that way from the beginning. And Joseph was blessed. The Lord was with him. So many lives were saved, not because of Joseph, though God loved Joseph and did do good for him, but because of the whole world and to bring Jesus through all of this. We get caught up in ourselves, don't we? In our own stories and our own problems. But the ultimate good for us is not a selfish good. It's the blessing for the whole world. And Joseph realized that by the end. And so I just want to end here, go through some themes and some ideas in his story. I know that I recapped pretty fast. You might want to go back and read it yourself if it's been a while. But I wanted to get to these themes so we can see what the big picture is. God's providence are what secures God's promises. It wasn't up to Joseph. It wasn't up to Jacob and the brothers. God's providence, his ability, his sovereign control is what makes it happen, right? And Joseph, through his integrity in a lot of ways, got to play a big role in that, right? God used him for good things. Here's another one. God's favor is the real route to success. He favors people of integrity and faith. It's interesting. We live in a country that is obsessed with success, with climbing the ladder. Joseph, he just did good work and tried to please the Lord, and God was with him, and that's what made the success happen. And the same is going to be true for us. We don't have to pull other people down. We just have to do what God has called us to do. Another thing is hold on to integrity no matter what happens. I wonder if Joseph knew when Potiphar's wife was trying to seduce him that this might lead to a prison cell, to refuse her. And yet he still held on to his integrity. And it might have felt like he made the wrong decision for a couple of years when he was in prison, but he didn't. His integrity was what led to him being second in command of Pharaoh. And so hold on to integrity no matter what. And don't fight with your family is another theme. With your siblings, with your parents, with your kids. And don't show favoritism. I think one of the worst things that parents can do is favor one kid over another. Poof. It didn't turn out well in this story. It never turns out well in real life. Genesis, there's a series of recurring threats that sort of endanger the survival, the purity of the covenant that God made. And in Joseph's story, all the threats converge, and it creates an impossibly dire situation for Jacob and his family. They're going to starve. But there's a few threats that are major. Family division and violence, reminiscent of Cain and Abel, that threatens the survival of the promises of God, right? And through that, instead of exacting revenge, Joseph reconciles with his brothers and restores family unity by extending forgiveness, right? That anger, that fighting, that was a serious problem, and it's a serious problem with us too. And what solves it, what brings reconciliation, is extending forgiveness and seeking it ourselves. Another threat was that unrighteousness and intermarriage with foreign nations threatened the purity of the covenant line. Remember Judah? And possibly losing the land. But Joseph settles his family in Goshen. I didn't read that part. But he shields them from cultural influences. He safeguards the nation of Israel from the danger of intermarriage with other nations. And then there's a global famine. That's a huge threat. Everybody could die of starvation, including the people of the covenant, right? But Joseph preserves his family and the entire world through his wisdom and through administration, right? Saving the grain. So through Joseph, God is reversing the curse, unraveling the violence through forgiveness, unrighteousness through righteousness, hunger through wisdom. And God fulfills his promises. So Joseph, through his integrity, keeps the world from starvation. But God, through Joseph, keeps his promises for the world continuing. And God is the real hero of the whole Bible and of the world, right? Any questions, any comments? Yeah, Joanne? Oh, here's a microphone so we can hear you on the recording.
It's just a request. I was writing that down. I got unrighteousness with righteousness. There were two others I missed.
What I just said? Yeah. Through Joseph, God is reversing the curse, unraveling violence through forgiveness, unrighteousness through righteousness, and hunger through wisdom. Mike.
There's another underlying important theme going on between Joseph and his family that speaks to all of us. There are consequences to sin, That's part of Joseph bringing them.
Yeah.
And the consequences of sin lead to conviction. The brothers were convicted of sin. They came back, and through conviction comes repentance and confession. They repented and confessed to this.
Yeah.
And then comes restoration with God and one another. He brings us back into unity.
That's great. Thank you for sharing that. That's very good. Yes, Phil.
We are continuing the story. God's promises have all not been fulfilled yet. They are being fulfilled. In our world, in the wars, in the fall of our nation into sin, all of this, God is still in control, still bringing out his final victory, which we read in Revelation and the other apocalyptic. But we're part of that story. And we've been chosen to work with God, for God to work with us, to bring about his eternal purposes.
And not just the same story, but the same God that we have. Yeah. Last one over here.
The principles that are brought out in the story of what it takes to humble hard hearts, what it takes to bring us to the place of purity before the Lord are very personal to each of us. And if we surrender quickly to the Lord, we can save ourselves lots of trouble.
Good. Now, I got to the last chapter of Genesis, but that doesn't mean I'm done with the class on Genesis. Next week, Jeff is going to be your teacher. But after that, we will kind of do some summary for the book, some visual things so that you can remember what we've learned through this time. All right, thanks for coming.